Okay, this is the first video just to show and illustrate how the use case 1 was implemented for the Medium articles. So just to refresh your memory, what use case 1 was is we're going to be executing Python code based on a HTTP request coming into Direktiv, or HTTPS. The basic flow of this workflow is a user would send this HTTP or HTTPS request. The body would contain the Python or Golang or JavaScript, whatever you want to execute. But the API gateway will firstly receive this request. We're going to bypass all the authentication plugins. We just want to do this anonymously. The second step in the gateway is the inbound plugin, and for this one we're going to use the request convert plugin. This plugin just copies all the headers for this request into a headers object as part of the body. And the reason we want to do this is we want to expose these headers to the Direktiv workflow. So the headers, the URL parameters, everything can become components of the body or payload that is passed to the workflow at the end. The second part would be the target plugin. The target plugin, in this case, we're going to execute target flow, which is just going to send this payload which contains the body of the request, the headers, the URL parameters, everything. It's going to send it into Direktiv, into the workflow that we specify. In this case, I'm going to specify run python.yaml workflow. The first thing this workflow is going to do is going to convert this body object that we received, which is the Python script, but it's base64 encoded at this stage. We're going to convert that base64 to a text-plain file, and then we're going to put that inside the Python container, which is literally just a Python container from hub.docker.com. And then we're going to run that Python container and take the output. Right, that output is going to go into the outbound plugin, and the outbound plugin we're going to use is the JS JavaScript outbound plugin. And what we do here is we're taking the output from the workflow and we're copying it into the body of the response. And then we just talk back via the API gateway to the user. Okay, so let's first start with the GitHub repo. It's called the repo is called demo workflows, and you can see this is the content of this demo workflows repository. So the one we're specifically looking at today is going to be the run Docker container. This is the structure of that run Docker container. I'm going to flick over to my VS Code just for a second. So you can see it's mirrored in this case. So if we start at the top, I'm going to take you through each of the files that are relevant for this use case. So the first one is Python example. This is literally just a piece of Python code that does a simple request, loads the response, and then passes back the JSON object. So that's the first one that's important. The second one that's important is the gateway configuration. So what is the gateway configuration that we're passing to Direktiv for Direktiv to create this endpoint for us? So it's this one. So the run python code.yaml in the gateway folder, gateway v1. The reason I've named this is because I like my structure for the Direktiv synchronization to be code, gateway, services, workflows. This can be anything. It's up to how you want to do it. The most important part is defining what the file type is, so Direktiv knows what to load. In this case, I store my code there. I store my gateway configuration on the gateway v1 because I want to match v1 run Python code. Now, if we look at what this gateway config is going to do, is it's going to allow anonymous connections. It's going to create an endpoint at my Direktiv URL /ns, which refers to namespace, / the namespace name that I sync this repo into, which we'll do as well, / v1 run Python code. Right, now to illustrate that in Postman, this is the call I'm going to make. HTTP internal Direktiv /ns / demo workflows / v1 run Python code. And you'll see that that matches up this v1 run Python code. Now, as I explained in the overview, the first thing we're going to do is look at these plugins. Right. My first plugin is my inbound plugin, and I'm going to say to Direktiv, please convert the incoming HTTP request and copy the headers, queries, body, and the consumer. Consumer is authentication rules, not relevant really here, but I'm going to create an object that has headers, queries, body, and consumer in one JSON object that I'm going to send into my target plugin. Now, the target plugin is going to be target flow. So in this case, this target flow plugin configuration is send this object that I've just created with the request, body, headers, everything, send it to the namespace demo workflows and send it specifically into a flow called run docker container workflows, run docker python code service gateway. Well, really long name, but if you look at it, it is run docker container workflows, run docker service gateway. All right, we'll look at that next. And then my outbound plugin, as I explained in here, is when I receive the payload back from this workflow, it obviously contains all the data I want in there, but it also could contain a lot of extra data that we need in there. So now I'm going to use the JavaScript outbound plugin, and all I'm doing is I'm passing the body, which is the output from the Direktiv workflow, and I'm taking the key value pair. So key is output, and the value I'm creating a JSON object for it, and I'm putting it back as the only component of this body that we respond to. And if it doesn't make too much sense now, when you look at the output, the inputs and outputs, it'll make more sense. Right, so that is my workflow. My API gateway. So next, let's look at the workflow. Right, the workflow is exactly as I said. We get a payload from this API gateway. Now the payload contains this Python example.py, because when we send it via Postman, I add this python.py example, and we can just add it again. We'll do Direktiv workflows, demo workflows, run docker container code. There's my example Python. So it's sending it as part of the body. Now in Direktiv, and the API gateway obviously passes this through to Direktiv for the workflow engine. This workflow engine receives this as a base64 encoded string. What we're telling Direktiv to do is take that base64 encoded string, decode it, and store it as an internal variable for this workflow only, instance variable, and store it as a plain text. So basically, create a variable in Direktiv that contains the contents of this python example.py file. That's the first state. The next state, what we're going to do is we're going to say to Direktiv, please run action state. And this action that you're going to run is defined by this function called Python. Right. Now, if I look at this function definition Python, it says I need to run or call to this service called run docker container services python.yaml. So if we look at our services, python.yaml, it's nothing more than an image from hub.docker.com that we start up. We scale it to 1 because we're going to use this a lot, of size medium. And this is a init container that we use to translate from Direktiv to any container basically. So there's a whole article that we wrote on why this is now a lot easier. All right, back to the workflow. So take my Python service, and in my Python container, create me a file, and the file contents come from this variable that I just created. So all I'm doing is I'm creating a file inside the container that's called python.py, and that file just contains the contents of python example.py. And then run the following commands, python3 python.py, and this will execute that Python script inside the container. And from that point forward, I'm just doing JQ transformations because I'm going to get a lot of responses back. Going to get response back on the command if any errors occur, and then this transform basically is what we're sending back to the API gateway. And obviously, like I said, in the API gateway, all we're doing is we're just doing another JavaScript to copy that as the response now back to the user. Okay, So if we put all of this together, by the way, this is a GitHub repo. How I work with Direktiv repositories, if you go into Mirror, you can have a look at, you can add the GitHub, or you can actually add any Git repository as an endpoint, and then what we do is we sync the whole GitHub repo. So you can see this mirrors the config or the file structures in here. It also allows us to run obviously code directly from GitHub repositories. But this is the workflow that we're looking at right now. So you can see there's the code files, and I'm going to execute this. So let's fire this and let's have a look at what's going to happen. All right, so we returned, this is the Python code that executed. If we look at what happened inside this workflow, let's first do this. This is our input. Now remember, I said the input of the workflow to the workflow is the request coming in, copying all the bodies and sending it to the target. So that object we created into the workflow now is the headers, all the headers copied into it, and the body, that base64 encoded string, which is nothing more than this Python example.py, and consumers if we were going to configure consumers. Right, if we then look at the execution of the workflow, how did all of this fit together? Well, we received the input, we stored the code, and I believe if we look at this, we still might see the Python code in here. There's the Python code that we stored. I just created this as a workflow variable to show what it looks like. I stored the code, and then what happened is I instructed Direktiv to copy that file obviously into the container and run that one command called python3.py, and the output of this is that Python output. What we then do is we actually do a transform at the end where we copy all of this stuff. We only copy the output for the command into an output object, and if you want to know where that happens, it's right here. We're saying take dot return 0 output. It's JSON, so convert it back into a JSON object and create a JSON object called output with that output in it. That gets sent back to the API gateway. Now, the API gateway, we don't want to output the object output. We actually just want to output the array of JSON objects. So that's why we had the gateway configuration do this. Copy that output into the new body without the output key. And this is what we get. So this basically allows you to execute any Python command. In one of the next one, we're going to run multiple Python commands where we actually pass it requirements and a Python example to execute. And we'll show you how that works. So hopefully this was useful.